Good morning. I hope you had a great Thanksgiving holiday. Now, of course, we're all in on the holiday season with Christmas fast approaching. TV will include all the famous Christmas specials, The Grinch Who Stole Christmas, Charlie Brown's Christmas, the music, maybe we'll see some choirs on the different stations. Christmas lights and decorations are going up everywhere. Eggnog. I'm not sure exactly what eggnog is, how much of it's egg, how much of it's nog, but of course, endless commercials selling us the perfect Christmas gift. But I think even more so, the greater emphasis on giving to others, good cheer, a love and care and concern for others, that they would enjoy the holiday season as well. And of course, remembering the fact that Jesus was born, a revolutionary event of the ages. I mean, his birth and his death are the two biggest transformative things that have happened in our lives, that have brought us from a situation where there was no hope to where there is eternal hope. This morning, I want us to dive into our scriptures and to look at some of these ideas. And I think it can be best summed up with the word counterintuitive. Counterintuitive, it's an adjective. And it's contrary to what intuition or common sense would indicate. It's counterintuitive to think that by relaxing, you will perform better. We tell people in the playing sports to just relax. And yet it seems the opposite of wanting to be hyped up and ready to go. And yet when there's a level of comfort and ease into what you're doing, you actually a lot of times perform better. But a lot of things are counterintuitive. I think especially if you look at the Christmas holiday, joy is found in giving rather than receiving. That a virgin would give birth. That the king of the universe would be born into poverty. I think if I were to write a Christmas story about redeeming mankind, there would be a lot more angelic armies and trumpets and acclamations of Jesus' arrival and triumph and victory, rather than taking the approach of transforming the world through a pauper, an impoverished man. But today I want to take a look into the Old Testament in an account of one of the ways that God worked counterintuitively. It's a victory that happens through unexpected means, through a battle plan that no army of that time would probably come up with. It's a victory that teaches us important things about God and how to live. Ultimately, lessons for us to live lives pleasing to God. And so let's dive into the book of Joshua. We'll be turning to Joshua chapter 6. We'll be reading there in the very beginning, in verse 1. And of course, this is the famous account of the Israelite victory over the fortress city of Jericho. But in verse 1 it says, "Now Jericho was strongly fortified because of the Israelites, no one leaving or entering. The Lord said to Joshua, 'Look, I've handed Jericho, its king and its fighting men over to you. March around the city with all the men of war, circling the city one time. Do this for 6 days. Have 7 priests carry 7 ram's horns while the priests blow the trumpets. When there's a prolonged blast of the horn and you hear its sound, have all the people give a mighty shout. And the city wall will collapse and the people will advance, each man straight ahead.'" Well, at a minimum, this is a strange plan. There's no real battle strategy. They're not looking at the latest techniques for siege works. Maybe you remember Lord of the Rings, and they built those siege towers to bring up against the walls of Minas Tirith, and then that would be how they would climb into the city. There's no ongoing plan for catapults or trying to starve them out. I mean, that would be the typical strategy of this day, to lay siege to the city. And of course, it says here they got them bottled up, so to speak. But it does speak to repeatedly what happens in the Bible. God doesn't do what's expected. God often works in counterintuitive ways. He uses unusual methods and means to accomplish his purposes. Consider a few scriptures. In James chapter 1, verse 2, it says, "Consider it great joy, my brothers, whenever you experience various trials, knowing that the testing of your faith produces endurance." And perhaps Matthew 4, verse 44. "But I tell you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you." Or Mark 10, 31. "But many who are first will be last, and the last first." There are many other verses in the Bible we could have chosen, but it seems like there's a difficult path or a difficult way or a challenging way, and yet when we choose to follow God's direction in it, it turns out to be a blessing. I think we all know from experience that many of our greatest trials have actually produced great growth in us personally. Even as we wouldn't want to repeat them again, we can look back on them and see how God changed us. And actually, there can be a joy about what God did during that time. But James just takes it to the next level and says, hey, consider it joy when you're in the trial, knowing that God will produce something good from it. Of course, Matthew 5 goes very much against the way the world thinks. So many of the movies that are action-adventure are based on the idea of revenge and getting even. And yet here in verse 44 of Matthew 5 it says, "But I tell you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you." Care about your enemy. Pray for them. Pray for their salvation. Pray for them to be favorably disposed to you. Pray for them to surrender or whatever. But it's the opposite. The world tells you to crush your enemy, to defeat your enemy, to kill your enemy, to take advantage of your enemy by whatever means necessary. God says, treat your enemy with kindness. But we can see throughout history how kindness has been transformative when it's turned to the people that have actually been the enemy or the persecutor or the oppressor. And the kindness and the forgiveness of someone loving an enemy has melted their hearts. It's changed them. It's made them different. I remember way back when apartheid was ending and Nelson Mandela came to power, one of the things that he sought to do was to have those who had been oppressed give forgiveness to their oppressors. And it was not the most well-received idea, and yet it was an incredibly transformative idea. It made a huge difference. It brought about a huge healing by people to go down the path of forgiveness and loving who had been their enemies and showing them kindness. Then, of course, but many who are first will be last, and the last will be first. It's all about surrendering your position and trusting that God will put you in the right place at the right time. Right now I'd like to stop for just a few minutes and have a discussion. And the question is, how is it that counterintuitive scriptures lead to victories? I'm sure we've had some great discussion about that, because we can see time and again how God's ways go against the world's ways, yet great things happen. We're going to continue reading on here in verse 8. And it says, "After Joshua had spoken to the people, 7 priests carrying 7 trumpets before the Lord moved forward and blew the trumpets. The ark of the Lord's covenant followed them. While the trumpets were blowing, the armed troops went in front of the priests who blew the trumpets, and the rear guard went behind the ark." And there's a little more detail here, but skipping down to verse 14, it says, "On the second day they marched around the city once and returned to the camp. And they did this for 6 days." So basically, the big event was to go take a walk around Jerusalem. And they did that once a day for 6 days. I was doing a little research on this and looking up the archaeology of it. And the truth is, most believe that Jericho was not necessarily a huge city. It's a fortified city, so it was not trivial to take it. But it was not like it was a 5-hour march around it. Most of them think it was probably less than 30 minutes to march around the entire city. And so basically, they took a short walk each morning, blowing some trumpets, and then went back and made camp for the rest of the day. They made lunch. Maybe they did a little bit of training here or there. They had dinner. Maybe they had their evening prayers. But it was not a big ordeal. It was not a big training ceremonies that they were going through or training days in preparation. But the question is, what is God teaching? I think that's one thing God is always teaching through his commands and his directions. God is teaching here that obedience matters. Israel is not like other nations. They're going to be led by the priests and God's presence symbolized by the Ark of the Covenant being out front. The being in the Lord's favor is much more important than military strategy or training and many other things. As we look at the world today, we are called to act very differently from those who are not Christians. We're to speak differently. We're to behave differently. We're to live differently. We're to be a people known for kindness and generosity and love and patience. We're to be known for helping those that are in need. We're to be known for not retaliating, but to treating the office backstabber with kindness rather than vitriol. We're called to be a different person living in this world, and that will naturally stand out. I think sometimes that can be very challenging to be the different person. It doesn't take very long for people to figure out that the kind of language you use is often not what they use. Granted, there are people that are not using foul language all the time, but it's funny how quickly they can figure out, oh, you don't cuss, you don't swear, you don't talk about people behind their back. But the discussion question I'd love to for us to have at this moment is, what is a challenge for you when it comes to living differently from the world? Well, hopefully you guys had a good time sharing about the different challenges you face. And I know when I'm in having those discussions, it's often encouraging for me to find out we're all in the battle together. Each of us battling something slightly different. Maybe some of us have a couple things in common, but we're all working together to live counterculturally, in some sense to live counterintuitively. But let's go on to Joshua chapter 6, and we'll close out here with this passage. Beginning in verse 15, it says, "Early on the seventh day, they started at dawn and marched around the city 7 times in the same way." That was the only day they marched around the city 7 times. After the 7th time, the priests blew the trumpets, and Joshua said to the people, "Shout, for the Lord has given you the city." And skipping on down to verse 20, it says, "So the people shouted, and the trumpets sounded. When they heard the blast of the trumpet, the people gave a great shout, and the wall collapsed. The people advanced in, each man straight ahead, and they captured the city." Imagine being an Israelite in this moment. First of all the soldiers here had been wandering throughout the desert for 40 years, waiting to finally come into the promised land. They're finally in the promised land. They've crossed the Jordan, and they have their first battle there. And they followed God's commands to the letter. And God brought about an unbelievable victory. God basically, we don't know exactly what happened, caused an earthquake or caused the walls to fall down, or something miraculous happened so that suddenly their impregnable defense was very pregnable, and they were able to charge right in and conquer the city, to take the spoils of war and to accomplish God's purposes. But one of the key things that we notice here is, and Israel didn't always do this, but here they obeyed God's plan every day for 6 days, and then they followed through with the special 7 laps and the shouting on the 7th day, and God brought about the victory. I think it's important to remember that God was blessing their obedience as much as anything else. Their cooperation in the plan, their trusting in Him. God is rewarding that. He's fulfilling His promises to them as they are enjoying His favor and in a healthy relationship with God. But if you think about your life, remember the moments where you followed God's ways, even when it was hard or strange, or you stood out, or it was difficult. Remember the victories that came from that. And sure, there were some days that it didn't work out as you'd hoped, and there was a defeat, but what about the victories? How did those moments feel when you did it God's way and it was a resounding victory? Think about that. God teaches us over and over His ways are different from the culture that we are surrounded by. And over, that if we are obedient to his ways, it will bring victory. Now, we always want the kind of victory that's like everything works out, we get the job, the family is going perfectly, we're able to have enough money to retire. Like, we are always in search of these physical blessings. But what God is teaching us over and over is that he's going to give us spiritual victory. That we're going to be able to overcome the forces of evil, the forces of Satan. And that the victory is clearly from God, and it's not from us. It's not from our own wisdom or our own techniques or our own battle plans or what we did. Certainly we are partnering with God. But the biggest partnership that we provide is obedience and trust. And God will work through that. And he'll teach us and train us to do whatever it is we need to do. But it begins with our trust and obedience to God. You know, he's teaching us that when we trust him, we trust his promises, that he will fulfill them, that he will take care of us. You know, I think it's very powerful for us to be able to look into the Bible and see all of God's promises and the fact that he consistently fulfills them. You know, the fact that it is clear that God is standing out and bringing about the victory. I mean, it was clear to the Israelites here. I mean, walls on fortified cities just don't naturally fall down. And yet, what looked like an impregnable city and a difficult assault was over in a matter of hours because God brought the walls down. You know, it's important to remember that the spiritual victory is sometimes not what the world would consider a victory. You know, we will have trials, but God is working on our behalf for eternity's sake. God is much more concerned about the long game than just the short temporal game that we often get caught up in as human beings. And so right now I'd like to pause for our last discussion. And that question is, what is a victory you have had living out a counterintuitive scripture? Well, I hope you enjoyed those victory stories. And I hope that this morning has been a help to you to see how God works in unexpected ways, the power of his counterintuitive plans. And he has a great desire to help you thrive in this Christian life. Pray that you would have a great holiday season and you would enjoy the day. Take care. Bye-bye.